committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on oversight of the report by Special Counsel Robert Mueller III, former White House counsel Donald McGahn II. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. More than a year ago, White House counsel Don McGahn sat for the first of several interviews with Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Over the course of those interviews, he described how the President directed him to have the Special Counsel fired. He described how the President ordered him to lie about it. He described several other obstructive incidents outlined in the Special Counsel's report. The President, in contrast, refused to be interviewed by the Special Counsel or even to answer written questions about his attempts to obstruct the investigation. Instead, to address the allegations spelled out by Mr. McGahn and outlined in the report, President Trump relied on his preferred mode of communication. He took to Twitter to call Mr. McGahn a liar. His lawyers went on cable television to do the same, to call Mr. McGahn a liar. There are reports of the President and his lieutenants exerting other kinds of pressure on Mr. McGahn. In short, the President took it upon himself to intimidate a witness who has a legal obligation to be here today. This conduct is not remotely acceptable. The White House asserts that Mr. McGahn does not have to appear today because he is entitled to, quote, absolute immunity, unquote, from our subpoenas. We know this argument is wrong, of course, because the executive branch has tried this approach before. In 2007, President George Bush attempted to invoke a similarly broad and unjustified assertion of executive privilege and asked his former counsel, Harriet Miers, to ignore a subpoena issued by this committee. Ms. Miers also did not appear at her scheduled hearing. Judge John Bates, who was appointed by President Bush, slapped down that argument fairly quickly. Quote, "The executive cannot identify a single judicial opinion that recognizes absolute immunity for senior presidential advisors in this or any other context. That simple yet critical fact bears repeating. The asserted absolute immunity claim here is entirely unsupported by the case law." Close quote from the judicial decision. In other words, when this committee issues a subpoena, even to a senior presidential advisor, the witness must show up. Our subpoenas are not optional. Mr. McGahn has a legal obligation to be here for this scheduled appearance. If he does not immediately correct his mistake, this committee will have no choice but to enforce the subpoena against him. Mr. McGahn did not appear today because the President prevented it. Just as the President has said that he would, quote, fight all subpoenas, close quote, issued by Congress as part of his broader efforts to cover up his misconduct. This stonewalling makes it all the more important to highlight some of the incidents that Mr. McGahn is said to have witnessed. Let me recount some of them. We know that the President directed Mr. McGahn to prevent then Attorney General Sessions from accusing himself from overseeing the investigation into Russian election interference. On March 3rd, 2017, shortly after Attorney General Jeff Sessions did recuse himself from the Russia investigation, the President summoned Mr. McGahn to the Oval Office. According to the Mueller report, quote, "The President opened the conversation by saying, 'I don't have a lawyer,' unquote. The President told Mr. McGahn that he wished that Roy Cohn was his attorney instead. Roy Cohn, of course, is known principally as the chief architect of the Army McCarthy hearings that destroyed so many lives back in 1954, an actual political witch hunt, not the imaginary kind the President decries. Mr. Cohn served as President Trump's lawyer for a long time, defending the President against federal discrimination suits before he, that is Mr. Cohen, was ultimately disbarred for unethical practices in 1986. Mr. McGahn refused to follow blindly into unethical behavior. Mr. McGahn told the President that the Department of Justice ethics officials had weighed in and that Mr. Sessions would not unrecuse himself, and he advised the President not to have any contact with Mr. Sessions on the matter. Days later, the President did exactly the opposite. He summoned Mr. McGahn and Mr. Sessions to Mar-a-Lago, where the President again, quote, expressed his anger, unquote. He said he wanted Mr. Sessions to act as his fixer. He said he wanted Mr. Sessions to undo his recusal and to limit the scope of the investigation. But Mr. Sessions, too, refused the President's orders. On June 17, 2017, the President took his displeasure a step further. He called Mr. McGahn at home and directed him to order Rod Rosenstein to fire Robert Mueller. Mueller has to go, the President barked. Call me back when you do it. Once again, Mr. McGahn refused. This time, Mr. McGahn felt the President's behavior was so inappropriate that he said he would rather resign than trigger a constitutional crisis. In early 2018, after press reports described the President's attempt to force Mr. McGahn to remove the special counsel on his behalf, the President repeated his pattern. He summoned Mr. McGahn to his office and he got angry. Quote, "This story doesn't look good. You need to correct this. You're the White House counsel." Close quote. President Trump told Mr. McGahn. "What about these notes? Why do you take notes?" the President said to Mr. McGahn, inquiring why Mr. McGahn had documented their conversation. The President then told Mr. McGahn to tell the American people something that was not true. He asked him to deny those reports publicly. Mr. McGahn again refused the President's order. He refused the President's order to lie to the American people on the President's behalf. 6 months later, the President announced that Mr. McGahn would be leaving the White House. The special counsel found Mr. McGahn to be, quote, "a credible witness with no motive to lie or exaggerate given the position he held in the White House," close quote. That's from the Mueller report. The special counsel also found the following, quote, "substantial evidence indicates that by June 17, 2017, the President knew his conduct was under investigation by a federal prosecutor who could present any evidence of federal crimes to a grand jury. Substantial evidence indicates that the President's attempts to remove the special counsel were linked to the special counsel's oversight of investigations that involved the President's conduct, and most immediately to reports that the President was being investigated for potential obstruction of justice. Substantial evidence indicates, and these are all quotes from the report, substantial evidence indicates that in repeatedly urging McGahn to dispute that he was ordered to have the special counsel terminated, the President acted for the purpose of influencing McGahn's account in order to deflect or prevent further scrutiny of the President's conduct towards the investigation. Substantial evidence indicates that the President's efforts to have Sessions limit the scope of the special counsel's investigation to future election interference was intended to prevent further investigative scrutiny of the President and his campaign's conduct. Close quote. Those are all quotes from the special counsel's report. I believe that each of these incidents, documented in detail in the Mueller report, constitutes a crime. But for the Department of Justice's policy of refusing to indict any sitting president, I believe the President would have been indicted and charged with these crimes. I am not alone in this belief. Over 900 former federal prosecutors from across the political spectrum, whose job was to determine when the elements of a crime have been satisfied, have agreed that the President committed crimes that would have been charged if he were not the sitting President. And I believe that the President's conduct since the report was released, with respect to Mr. McGahn's testimony and other information we have sought, has carried this pattern of obstruction and cover-up well beyond the four corners of the Mueller report. The President has declared out loud his intention to cover up this misconduct. He told Mr. McGahn to commit crimes on his behalf. He told Mr. McGahn to lie about it. After the report came out, the president claimed that Mr. McGahn lied to the special counsel about what happened. Then he directed Mr. McGahn not to come here today so that the public would not hear his testimony and so that we could not question him. President Trump may think he can hide behind his lawyers as he launches a series of baseless legal arguments designed to obstruct our work. He cannot think these legal arguments will prevail in court, but he can think he can slow us down and run out the clock on the American people. Let me be clear. This committee will hear Mr. McGahn's testimony, even if we have to go to court to secure it. We will not allow the president to prevent the American people from hearing from this witness. We will not allow the president to block congressional subpoenas, putting himself and his allies above the law. We will not allow the president to stop this investigation, and nothing in these unjustified and unjustifiable legal attacks will stop us from pressing forward with our work on behalf of the American people. We will hold this president accountable, one way or the other. It is now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all that have gathered here again. Here we go again. The theater is open, and the summations are coming in. In fact, right now we're again running over the norms of congressional oversight. We're dabbing at the edges of rubbing roughshod on the Constitution, asking for things that we don't. But I am glad about one thing. I'm glad that the chairman read into the record today the Mueller report. I'm glad that he quoted, as he said, this is a quote directly from the Mueller report. I just wish my chairman would actually go read the rest of it that he has been offered to read, which he has chose not to read. But he did leave out one thing. He left out something in the Mueller report from just now. He read McGahn's testimony beautifully, did everything right, but he left out what he doesn't want to have to come back to, and the frustrating thing that has brought us here again and again and again, and that is the conclusions. There was no collusion. There was no obstruction charge. There's nothing here. After 2 years of doing this, we can read it in. You can talk about how you don't like it. You can talk about what you would like to ask. But at the end of the day, it's interesting. We'll read in the quotes that make the headlines, but we're also not going to read in the bottom line of what was actually concluded. So the Democrats are here trying again. The Mueller report concluded there was no collusion, no obstruction, because the report failed to provide damning information against the president. The majority claims we need to dig deeper. Deeper than the 2 years of investigation conducted by what is considered a prosecutorial dream team, because that probe ended without criminal charges against the president or his family. The special counsel closed up shop without giving Democrats anything to deliver to their base. Now the Democrats are trying desperately to make something out of nothing, which is why the chairman has, again, haphazardly subpoenaed today's witnesses. That move, though, has actually ensured the witness will not testify. You know, this is becoming a pattern. The chairman knew this, I believe, when he sent the subpoena last month, but instead of inviting the witness to testify voluntarily and working with McGahn's counsel to find mutual agreeable time and scope for the testimony, the chairman rushed to maximize headlines by issuing a subpoena. That subpoena was the third in just 4 months, more subpoenas than the prior chairman issued in 6 years. The chairman has several ways out here. He took none of them. The chairman could have invited the witness to testify voluntarily. That was the practice in the 1990s when the White House counsel testified before Congress, but the chairman did not do that. Instead, he launched a subpoena at the witness without any consultation or follow-up with the witness's lawyer. The chairman could have invited the witness to testify behind closed doors, but that would have been politically expedient, and you wouldn't have been here, and the show would not have been as exciting. A closed-door conversation would not have generated those headlines, and everything that we're looking at today, even gaveling in today's hearing without a witness, is theatrical. The cameras love a spectacle, and the majority loves the chance to rant against the administration. I just am glad today to see that we don't have chicken on the dais. The chairman orchestrated today's confrontation when he could have avoided it because he's more interested in the fight than fact-finding. Take the Mueller report, which we've already heard quoted from. More than 99% of the Justice Department has offered to the chairman. For an entire month, the chairman has refused to take a look at it. The Attorney General who volunteered to testify before the committee, the chairman changed the rules for the first time in the committee's 200-year history, thus blocking General Barr from testifying. I cannot emphasize this enough. The track record demonstrates he does not actually want information. He wants the fight, but not the truth. The closer he actually comes to obtaining information, the further we run from it. The Democrats claim the need today's witness to investigate obstruction of justice, but that investigation was already done. Robert Mueller spent 2 years running it and then closed it. We're not a prosecutorial body, but a legislative body that does have valid congressional oversight. But let's talk about that Mueller report for just a second. It's really interesting to me that the Mueller report was actually, within 24 hours of coming out, the chairman and the majority subpoenaed for all the documents. In fact, we have an illegal subpoena that actually the Attorney General to provide documents he cannot legally provide. That's been covered in this committee for the last 2 weeks exhaustively, and even the panel that was with us last week agreed that the subpoena asked the Attorney General to do something illegal by exposing 6E information. That was his own witnesses said that last week. But you know what's interesting to me is that we've subpoenaed the documents, we've subpoenaed that we want underlying documents, we've subpoenaed stuff that we can't get, but you know the one thing that we seem to avoid is Mr. Mueller himself, the one who wrote it. We've asked since April about Mr. Mueller coming. But every time we seem to get closer to Mueller, Mueller just gets pushed on a little bit. Hadn't seen a subpoena here, and this is what's really amazing. We'll get back to subpoenas in a moment, but just think about that. You wanted the work of the author, but you don't want to talk to the author. Keep that pinned for just a moment. When we look at this, 99% of the information is at the Democrats' fingertips. And it's a Mueller report Attorney General offered to Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Adler, and others have seen it, but they refuse. So don't be fooled. Majority wants the fight, they want the drama. He does not actually want the information he claims to be seeking. After the administration made volumes of information available to this committee, the chairman issued overbroad subpoenas and now harangues the administration for being unable to comply with those subpoenas. In fact, it's the Democrats who are not engaging in an accommodation process, abruptly cutting off negotiations and rejecting olive branches by the administration. This is where I want to come back to something my chairman just said a moment ago. His quote was, in his opening statements, that our subpoenas are not optional. Well, we found out a lot about subpoenas over the last month or so in this committee. I found out that subpoenas maybe now are not optional. Let's add to the list. Subpoenas are also a discussion starter. A subpoena is to give us better standing in court. Not my quotes, the chairman's quotes. So what is it? Is a subpoena the legal document that we've talked about all along in here and the forceful document that all attorneys in this country actually use? Or is it a discussion starter? Is it to help our standing in court? Or is it we don't want it ignored? At this time, it is amazing to me that the accommodation process, and we talk about the committee, and the chairman forcefully talked about our oversight. I agree with the chairman on this point. This committee and all committees in Congress have oversight responsibilities, but it is also the sacred responsibility of the chairman and the majority to use it properly and to not headlong rush into subpoenas when you don't get to what you want. That's all we've seen in 5 months here. When we don't get what we want, we subpoena. The first one was the acting attorney general. We subpoenaed and then we backed off, we caved. Then everything else has become a race to get a headline. The accommodation process, not happening. The accommodation process, never here. So don't be fooled. You may have come wanting, you may have an opinion that says everything is wrong today with the Mueller report and the president is guilty. But don't undercut congressional oversight because you can't wait. That's the problem we have right now. And so the question is, are we tearing at the fabric of congressional oversight? It was really interesting to hear some of that last week. When you have a committee that has issued subpoenas that ask the Attorney General to do something illegal, when you have subpoenas when no accommodation process has been put in place, when you have contempt issues that have been in part with no process and no time going through, I just submit to you this. Whatever your opinion on the Mueller report, great, glad you have it. But you didn't get it here today, and you're not getting it from this committee because this committee undoubtedly doesn't like the author or want to talk to the author of the report. They just want to talk about the report and make innuendo and attack the president at the middle of the day when this committee, who has charge of immigration, who has charge of intellectual property, who we've touched none of, with a crisis at the border, we have an admission that the economy's good, jobs are happening, unemployment is at its lowest rate. I guess at the end of the day, we can't find something that the Mueller report lets them hang their I-word, impeachment on, which they can't even agree on, because the president is continuing to do his job. And we're here, again, with the circus in full force. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman. Move strike last word.
The gentleman from Tennessee.
Move to adjourn.
Motion is made to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman,
Motion to adjourn is not debatable. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
No.
Recorded vote.
Do I hear a request for recorded vote?
Request for recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll on the motion to adjourn. Do you have the clerk?
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Aye. Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell? Aye. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat?
No, and this is disgraceful.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko? Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes no.
Is there anyone who wishes to vote who hasn't voted? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 21 ayes and 13 noes.
There are 21 ayes and 13 noes. The motion to adjourn is adopted and the hearing is adjourned.